Welcome to Dive into World Building. And we're talking about economics today, and it looks like this is a really popular topic, or everybody's busy. But you know what? This is actually one of the most important, must-address topics of world building, I think, to be honest. If you don't have a sense of the economy of the world that you're working with, it's going to seem awfully thin. So like knowing where resources come from and how they're purchased and why the rich are rich. A really important thing. You can't just have rich people randomly and then not know why they're rich. I know that sounds weird, but like when I was first designing Varin, I was like, so you've got these rich people because you always have rich people and poor people and whatever, right? And my husband goes, so why are they rich? And I'm like, oh. And he goes, well, typically it's because they own the land, and so as a result of that, they basically own all the proceeds off the land, and then they have to pay people, right? But they get a cut of everything right at the bottom. That's a sort of the feudalist sort of model is that the rich people are rich because they own the land, and then they can kind of basically skim off of everybody really easily. Yeah. Obviously, you've got other ways to get rich too, though, because you've got being a merchant. And running a business and bringing in money that way, and you can also get into all the kinds of things that people do in our world where they dodge taxes and things like that. But it's kind of interesting to think about that from both directions, because in a way there are a number of ways to become rich, and the rich people who've become rich in different ways don't always get along. And there are tons of stories in English literature about people who own the land, but that's all they own, and then they start getting, poor nobility kind of problems, and they have to go after the merchants to get the money, right? So there's lots of potential for conflict there.
Impoverished nobility is a big favorite of mine.
Ooh. There's so much great conflict, like internal and external conflict from that.
Yep.
I
don't know why. Yeah.
Merchants who want to buy into a title, and then the nobility who need it to pay their creditors or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, and there's that sense. There's also that sense of the lifestyle to which one has become accustomed.
Yeah.
Right? So that's always kind of fascinating to me. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got that idea.
Outward appearance too. Maintaining outward appearances too, like maintaining outward appearances in order to keep your title when you don't have the finances.
Well, and there's a conspicuous consumption example. People conspicuously consume for a reason. And this can all enter in. You don't just have to be an impoverished noble to engage in conspicuous consumption. Right? I mean, at a certain point, the amount of fabric in your dress was a way of showing people how rich you were. Right?
Yeah.
Like how many layers of skirts you were wearing was an indicator of whether you were well off, and that gives you a sort of social capital that's a little bit not quite independent from your actual monetary capital, but but not quite congruent with it, so that, you know, conspicuous consumption can actually help you to become more successful.
Yeah.
Another thing that conspicuous consumption can do, well, it's not, in a way, it's not conspicuous consumption because it's not the same, quite the same thing. But I'm going to talk passing is what I'm thinking of. Right. The idea that in order to get something done or to be listened to, you have to be recognized as a member of a group that is worth listening to, right?
Yeah.
And in order to pass for a member of that group, you're gonna make an incredible investment in something, some symbol that shows people, like a purse or a belt that's really expensive, or a pair of shoes, or an outfit that allows you to, in a sense, buy your way into a conversation that you would not otherwise be able to have.
Like logos on clothing.
Right.
I hate. I've always hated that.
You know, but to be listened to by a bank manager, or you know, to basically, it's to escape the instant judgment that you are poor and therefore not worth engaging with. Right?
I keep thinking of Scarlett O'Hara. She makes that dress out of curtains to kind of like make it appear as though she's well off.
Yeah. That's a good
Which
example.
is interesting because I think her internal strife there is not even for like anybody socially, it's for Rhett Butler. So
well,
it's
that's
just
socially.
yeah, but it like in a private, in a private kind of setting. So it's like it's very much about pride, the pride attachment to your wealth.
Yeah.
Instead.
I'm going to try to get a few more people in here. It's kind of causing people trouble today.
That must be across the board.
Yeah, I don't know why it's giving people trouble. And it's not letting me invite either, which is frustrating.
I'm sorry. So yeah, so materials. See, and this is interesting too, because however your economic system is, and you've done this in Barron with clothing, but it definitely the material goods, the conspicuous consumption, how you define that, what defines your status, what it indicates, and then characters who are, for whatever reason, playing with the outward appearance of wealth.
Yeah.
In the science fiction context, I think that there are amazing things that can be done with that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so okay, so for a minute I'm gonna talk about money. It's always important to have a sense of what money is.
High school econ.
In your society.
Well.
You know, I mean, I think, honestly, I know that sounds kind of weird, but what money is actually a big question. I mean, a lot of people are going to go for default, and they're going to go, well, money is exactly the same thing that it is in my life, right? When you think about money, though, money is more...
There it is.
Money is less an object and more an agreement. It's almost like it's more of a psychological thing than it is a physical thing. So barter, you can kind of say, well, we can weigh the relative merits of, the relative value of these two things, but there's still a lot of subjectivity there. What is the value of a thing, right?
Yeah.
It depends on who the person is. And so, money, there was this whole thing about the gold standard and whether we should, or whether we should try to maintain the gold standard. Here's Glenda, yay!
Hi, Dorothy.
I'm sorry it's been so difficult to get in today. It's just, I don't know what is going on with the technology. Yeah! Cheers! Anyway, so what I was going to say is money is so very psychological, right? And I have a great example. Now, see, I tried to get my husband to come and attend the hangout today, and unfortunately he had a lunch date and he couldn't make it. But my husband is an avid reader of all sorts of things, and he's, my hair is kind of out of crazy. But anyway, I'm going to go for the Rooster Doo look today. But he has worked in financial services for periods of time, and so he's got all these ideas about money and stuff. He was the one who, when I was designing Barter, said to me, well, if you really want to bring down this society, you have to have, problems with money, and people who are going into debt or gambling a lot and going into debt to merchants, and then the merchants aren't able to get their money back, and then the nobility are like, well, this isn't right because people who are a higher status than you owe you money, so we're just going to say, well, you don't owe them money anymore. And then that'll fix it, right? No, except it makes everybody really, really unhappy, and it doesn't end well. So that's one of the things that's going on, is that actually members of the higher castes, and particularly the soldier caste, are gambling a lot with these merchants and then losing money, and then they owe a lot of money to the merchants, and it's the same thing that happened in feudal Japan, where you have this problem where the higher castes are supposedly more noble, but they owe a lot of money, and then what are you going to do? So it's very complicated. The thing that my husband brought up that he wanted me to talk about, since he couldn't make it here, was the situation of hyperinflation in Brazil. Now, he's been reading the book 1493, and he's talking right now about with me about how it was actually the Mongols who invented hyperinflation.
Wow.
Well, so they printed a lot of money, and the thing is, the more money there is, the more it's going to have less value in the eyes of the people, which is kind of interesting. So, okay, there was this case in Brazil. Brazil had this, runaway hyperinflation where people had to reprice things in stores on a daily basis, right? I mean, kind of crazy, right? So what happened was there were these couple of professors of economics, I think they were economics, and they had this idea about how to stop the inflation, right? And they tried to approach the government about it. Oh, shoot, when was this? Not that long ago. It wasn't it was this century for sure.
Oh.
Not this century.
Well,
it would have been end of the last century.
Yes.
right.
I still have trouble with that.
So confusing. So definitely within the last 50 years, I would say.
Okay, yeah, like the 80s or the 70s or something.
Yeah, kind of like that. That's what I think. That's what I think was going on. Anyway, so they had approached the government, and the government was like blowing them off and basically saying, "No, shoot, we just lost Richie. We're not going to take." They weren't taking them seriously with their proposal, right? And finally, it was getting so bad that they said, "Actually, we're going to do this." But by then, the professors were like, "No, you're not. We've seen what you're going to do. Sorry, no chance." So they went to the Brazilian professor's children and said, "No, really, please go to your parents and say that we're serious about this, and we will really actually do whatever they say." But so what was really fascinating about this was that what they did was they created a new currency, okay, and everybody was paid in this new currency, but then it got converted into the previous currency so that people could actually hand the currency out. Okay, and the value was updated every day. So let's say that you call this new thing, I can't remember what it's called. I should have done more research on this. But that's okay. So let's say you call this thing a real, for the sake of argument, because this is not what it was called, and I feel bad. But anyway.
That is one of their currencies, though.
Yeah. So, okay. So
you're in the right
they would say, okay, we've got this new currency unit that you're being paid in, and today it's worth this many of the previous type of currency, right? So what they set up was this system where people's pay was fixed and the value of it was fixed, right? But the conversion rate would change from day to day. So clearly, the old currency was still very unstable. And yet, the new currency in which people were being paid was very stable, right? And they basically did this for a period of time until everybody started knowing what this new currency was and what its value was, and everybody was happy to be paid in it and whatever. And then eventually, they just threw out the old currency. And by that time, they had established the new currency as being stable. So it was stable. Which sounds like almost like a big scam, except that it worked. It stopped the hyperinflation. I mean, I find that kind of thing fascinating, right? There we go. Here's a link. Yeah, look up hyperinflation in Brazil on Wikipedia. Well done, Che. But the point for this purpose is that it's the perception of stability that's just as important. Now, obviously, you have to stop doing things like, hi, Reggie, welcome back.
Hi.
Obviously, you have to stop doing things like just printing money hand over fist. But at the same time, the perception among the people is really critical. And so one of the things that's worth doing if you're world building is thinking about what the perception of money is. You know, and whether it's different between different social groups. Because generally speaking, money is perceived very differently by different social groups. And so that's actually one of the things that I like to play with and with the VAR and caste system, because the one rule about the VAR and caste system is that each caste has a different view on things, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that everybody has a different view on is money. And I make sure that I take little opportunities to talk about how people view money differently. You know, for the undercast, money is all bound up in pain and cost and paying other people, and it's like horrible. For the merchants, it's more fun and cool if you have some, sucks if you don't have any, but there's always an opportunity there. You know, for the laborers, money is a dirty, lower, merchanty thing, and we're going to barter with each other, and we're going to try to make sure that the merchants pay us properly for the things that we're selling to them, right? And then above that, so the laborers have their own sort of internal, since they're the ones producing the food, they have their own internal barter system, and they don't use money at all unless they're dealing with merchants. And then above that, you have basically like they're kind of like debit cards, right? Because this is a high technology society. So the further up you go, the more likely you are to use a debit card. The soldiers keep cash around because they like to gamble with it. So they'll carry cash for gambling and sort of recreational purposes. But the nobility don't even see cash. So, you know, I have a little scene in my novel where the family's just gotten a new bodyguard, and one of the cousins decides to sit down and try and play a game of Kazel marbles with him, which is, you know, a board game. And so they make a bet on something. And it's not on who's going to win the game. It's actually on whether they're going to be able to complete the game before the troublemaker comes out and stops them from playing the game. Okay? Anyway, so out comes the troublemaker and says, "What are you doing playing with my bodyguard? Stop it!" Right? And of course that means that the young noble cousin has won the bet, and so the bodyguard kind of laughs and says, "Okay, well here's your." And it's like 20. They bet like 20 cents, or I mean, like seriously, they bet like $1 on this. And he goes, "Well, so here's your 5 Orsheth," and he goes, "Whoa, is that real Orsheth?" Like, wow. And he goes, "Actually, that's a 5. do you want to see a 1 and a 2? I've got some. I can show them to you." Right? But like, there's this little tiny moment where you realize that this kid has never seen actual cash.
Yeah.
And it's fun for me because it's kind of one of these small incidental things that I like to work in that shows you the way things are different across the society.
See, my economic system in Spectra's End, which I just sent to Shay for beta read, it's all based on what you can do for yourself and what you can trade. And if you, let's say you're like if you have property, you're probably okay. You can do most things for yourself. But then, of course, you have like issues where, like bad seasons with your goods. But typically the landed people are okay because they can always sort of make do. Then you have there's a center of town, and there are just a very few shopkeepers. And the shopkeepers, which would be my merchant class, I suppose, are the ones who end up in trouble all the time because not everything that they have to trade is useful. So if they don't have useful things, they don't get the goods that will help them to survive.
Yeah, okay.
But there's not like a monetary system. Then you have another group, which is the hunters, and because they're hunters, they always have useful things to trade. But they sort of travel outside the village to hunting all the time. They don't have land. So it's not about what they, like goods and services that they have to trade because they have lots of goods and services. But by nature of the nomadic lifestyle, they're still kind of outsiders. So it's a little bit different when you get into start thinking about bartering systems and what is useful depending on your world building.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, there used to be an old-timey joke about old country doctors constantly getting paid in chickens.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can only eat so many chickens and so many eggs.
Right. That's funny. Yeah, barter's definitely got its drawbacks, which is why I think one of the reasons money was invented.
Yeah.
But also what Che brought up a few minutes ago on the chat bar is whether or not there's a central currency that's controlled by the government or by the nobility or whoever. You can also have systems where various commercial entities, usually banks, but it could be guilds or all sorts of entities, each have their own currency.
Yeah.
And then you have a really complicated system where people are doing barter among themselves and then trying to figure out conversion among all these different currencies, and well, we trust the currency from this entity and we don't trust the currency from that entity.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we're like, certain people insist on being paid by like the most trustworthy currency. There was some old movie, I almost want to say Beckett, but I'm not sure if it was that one, where the king says, the Swiss don't, the Swiss, it just boiled down to basically you had to pay the Swiss in gold. And they were like, the best mercenaries in Europe, and you had to pay them. Like, they would only accept gold, or they're not going to march for you.
Yeah.
Or even there, you can have a whole bunch of small kingdoms.
Yeah.
They each have their own currency, but they're so small and interconnected that people are dealing with all these different currencies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and you also have places like Israel where they will accept U.S. dollars as well as shekels.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're touching on something that's really interesting, which is the form in which the currency comes. Like, for example, like right now, in the U.S., you can pay in cash, you can use a check, you can use credit, and you can use your debit card. So there's all these different ways of doing it, and I think
different sort of terms of payment.
Yes, and I think that's interesting. And credit systems, if you get that far into it within a world building, and you have sort of sophisticated financial system, like the credit systems, I think are really interesting. And actually, again, Juliet, I think wasn't there something I read for you recently with I can't remember the names now. Is that terrible?
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's okay.
But it was it was about the trash guys. Charge, and there was a big problem involving their money, and it wasn't some of that to do with credit, or.
Okay, so since you asked, I think what it came down to was I needed to figure out how my undercast people were paid, because I knew that they had gangs, but I didn't know quite why or what they would do. And who people would be fighting and why. And I know that sounds is sort of a strange place to go into to get into money issues, but basically what I decided was that the trash people have gangs because they get paid in cash. And while it frees them up to make a lot of their own decisions on how to use the money that they're given, it opens them up to robbery.
Yeah.
And so what you have is, on payday at the trash center, everybody meets up with their gang to go home, because you don't want to be on the street, because basically all of the what I call the penniless gangs, even though penniless is not really a Varan term, but there are people out there who don't have a ready source of cash, and they know that these people are going to be walking home with a lot of money, so they just basically lie in wait for them on the main roads leading away from the trash center. And that's why the trash gangs have to be trash gangs, and this is why you have this gang warfare going on. But the fighting is actually not going on between the undercast people and the higher caste people. It's a sort of a self-predation that's set up by the way that these people are treated. So. Yeah.
That's like a good example about how your economic system really feeds into the social system and problems with crime, which I think is fascinating.
Yes. Money is definitely social system and crime related. And so just to take it a little step further, the prison workers, they get paid in housing and clothing, they get fed at work, and they get almost zero cash. So if you're working in prisons, you don't have a lot of flexibility. You're basically trapped in your lifestyle. And yet, as lifestyles go, it's got a lot of certainty.
Yeah.
Right? So these people are almost like upper class within the subgroup, which is sort of odd. They're a little bit like impoverished subnobility,
oh my gosh, yeah.
Anyway, these are the things that I discover when I start setting stuff up.
Yes.
Because you set stuff up and then you realize that it has these big consequences for the way that people interrelate with each other. And here I am looking at one group of people and discovering that within that one group of people there's this really strong division of types of people. So then the third group is the people who work at crematories.
Mm-hmm.
And they do not get fed at work because that would be kind of gross, right? And they have to be paid better because nobody wants to do it, because you know they're the teams that get sent out looking for dead homeless people's bodies, and I mean, like, they're dealing with death. Nobody wants to do this, so they have to be paid better. They also get housing. So they get housing and they get cash, but nobody wants their cash because it's death money, right? And to be seen taking death money is not a good thing, which is why the predation focuses predominantly on the trash workers, right? But they're almost like a pariah group within the undercaste. So, you know, like, it's funny what happens when you start getting down to the nitty-gritty of how people are paid, because you suddenly discover all these social perceptions of money and all these major social consequences that, you know, I had, like, that's what I love about working in this world, is that the further I go, the more I discover, and there's always an extra layer there of conflict and social complexity. You know, it's like it's waiting for me to pick it up. And so, of course I do, because that's what I geek out on. But yeah, I mean, it was really incredibly helpful, and it made the world so much more realistic to answer these really basic questions about how people are paid and what they're paid for. I mean, basic. They seem like really basic questions, right? But they have enormous consequences.
Exactly, and that's what's interesting. And then when you, you know, one of the things about science fiction that's so wonderful is that you can really address these kinds of things that pop up in consensus reality, and by giving it a different spin or a different set of parameters, you really examine issues that, like, can make you think about how we do things now. You know. And of course, I'm always thinking of the Western world because that's where I'm sitting. But
well, you know, but also taking inspiration for this kind of stuff from less well-known systems is great, because it's another way of questioning, you know, questioning the system that comes from, and also questioning our own. You know, I never felt like I knew English as well as when I was studying another language. Right? I mean, like, studying English helps you know a lot about English, and writing in English and reading in English, you know, teaches you a ton about English. But the things you learn about English when you're studying another language, wow, they're really different kinds of things. They're not the kinds of things that you will learn from an internal perspective. So similarly with looking at monetary systems and economics, taking a step outside of the system that we're most familiar with is super helpful. And so is research on subcategories and subcultures within our own society. You know, because I think there's a lot of myopia, right? Within our social groups, we know how things work because that's how we learn how things work. But we don't necessarily know how things work in other groups. And so you've had a lot of really interesting articles flying around the blogosphere in the last couple of years, because they're trying to debunk the sense that if you're poor, you shouldn't have an iPhone, or, you know, like all these weird sorts of things that these stereotypes about the poor that are being sort of brought out in the open and discussed suddenly. I think it's great that.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh, yes.
Poor, and I
But
know
I think
why.
it's great that we're seeing these things discussed because, in a way, we don't see what's going on around us. This is the whole idea of privilege, right? Cultural privilege is that we get surrounded by a social system and we can't see beyond it, and so it's easy to think that we know how things work. But what we do know is we know how things work within our little sphere. And then once we move outside of that, we have to realize that lots of fundamental assumptions are changing.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that. So, yeah. I am almost forgetting to take notes here, so I gotta make sure I got
Well, it's easy to forget to take notes when there's so much to cover and talk about.
I know. I get so excited about this, and I start waving my hands around, and then I can't take notes.
So, update on my costume stuff. My sleeves are done.
Yay.
Oh, yay. Awesome.
Wait.
Sorry, Che, that you've been having so much trouble. The self-replicating Che.
I know, and they're still there. The icons are still there. I don't know.
You know what? Don't worry about icons because we're all good.
Okay.
I would rather not have you try to get rid of the icons and then drop yourself out again because that would be
Yeah. No, I'm leaving it, man. Usually Google, but
I want to hear Che's example.
Yes.
Okay. I saw it was some documentary, and I don't know where it was, but it was, tribal people living in the jungle. And the women could actually, it was in economics, it was dying out because of actual currency or governmental currency and foreign currencies coming in. But what it was the women would print their own sort of money, and what it was leaves that were you would take the leaf when it's green and do almost a rubbing, and as it dried, the pattern would stay. And so you could make small square ones, or they would make really, really big ones, and the really, really big ones, of course, were worth a lot more. But it was really interesting because it was sort of almost like a really sort of like a quickie handicraft, like making the little one that you could fit between all the million other jobs the women had to do.
Right.
And that's why it was sort of worth something, and the women could take these things and trade them. The printed leaves could take them and trade them for, food and goods and whatever to other villages and things.
Yeah.
And they all had they were, geometric patterns. But again, it was one of those things where it was dying out because of, larger entities.
Yeah.
Coming in and saying that's not really currency, and
of course.
And then other people
basically undermining the core belief in it as a currency.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to this whole thing about the concepts underlying all of this and how incredibly subjective and flimsy they are.
Yes.
And I'm talking about our current thing, and that's why in the sidebar I had mentioned the Baroque cycle, because it's Neil Stephenson. It sort of follows not necessarily the invention of a particular currency. I mean, there is some of that in there, but a lot of it has to do with markets, how the markets started, and how that was invented, and how all of it was a con. That was kind of his point. It was just these people who wanted to become wealthy, and yeah. But anyway, he really addresses that, and it's incredibly in-depth, and I couldn't, I don't want to get into detail with it because it would take the rest of the talk, but it's worth looking at in terms of a consensus reality analog and how to handle that sort of invention thing in fiction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's something else that I want to actually bring up, because I promised that I would bring it up because Lillian can't make it today, and she's like my resident expert. She has the whole book. What is her book called? Let me make sure I look it up. I think it's called the Spellcaster's Handbook. The Writer's Spellbook, that's what it's called. The Writer's Spellbook, Creating Magic Systems for Fantasy by Lillian Zernicka. Okay, so she's got this book, and it's great. You know, I mean, she goes into all kinds of stuff about magic systems, but one of the things that comes out as really, really important here is that when you're dealing with magic, it's really another type of economy.
Okay.
It's, you know, treating magic as a resource.
Yes.
Is really important, because because if you don't if you start printing money, magic money, and anybody can use magic at any time, and we've got plenty of magic for everybody, and there's all kinds of magic, and there's no restrictions on it, what you get is runaway magic inflation, where in your story you can't do anything magical that's actually going to be meaningful because it's all too easy.
Yes.
Okay? And we'll call it runaway magicflation.
Yes.
But so one of the critical parts to creating a successful magic system is making sure that you build in the idea that magic is a resource and that it has restrictions on its use.
Yes.
There's the idea that magic always comes with a price, right?
Cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit analysis. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the greater the price that magic has, the more interesting it is, right? Because it becomes a conflict for the magic using character, right? Where either they have to give up something of their own strength in order to accomplish the magic, or they have to damage something about the environment in order to accomplish their magic. There's a lot of conflict there, which makes a story more interesting. You know, what is the price?
Okay, I'm gonna
think of Once Upon a Time and the the barter that Rumpelstiltskin always engages in, but you know, what is the price of magic is actually a really, really important question to answer if you have a magic system that you're working with in your work.
Yes.
And now Jay is back. Poor Jay.
I'm not even sure this is going to work or that I will stay, because it just keeps dropping me.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's probably, I don't know, Google's having some maintenance somewhere.
Yeah. You know, every so often we'll come in for one of these and it'll be just like this the whole time. Like the one where it was like just me and Glenda and we're looking at each other and going, you know, I think it must be Google keeping everybody else away. I don't know what's going on here.
But yeah, magic systems. What I really enjoy is, at least in terms of writing, is where magic creates as many problems as it solves.
Yeah.
We had talked about the Healing Wars in terms of magic being part of their economic system.
Right.
Last week we mentioned that, and then you know, and then of course I'm going to bring up Spectre's End again. And what I did there with the magic is that the magic is wildly unpredictable. And there are restrictions on it, so that if the population counts too much on any form of magic, and the person who wields that specific magic dies or is in peril somehow, then you lose the magic, which means that you've got to figure out a way to solve the problem that magic was solving from scratch without use of magic. So I tackle it there. But what happens then is that people who do have particularly useful forms of magic become very useful. And that both makes them privileged and in peril. It sort of also makes them in this world. But it's interesting. And then so there are really big costs.
Yeah.
Right? You know, somebody who shows that they can use magic, who lives in a particular area, if they come under the attention of a certain group, they're going to be drafted by that other group, right? So the
Right.
community loses that person. So you not only lose that magic in the community, you lose this person and what they brought to that community too.
Yeah. They are a resource in a way.
Yes.
That then gets fought over. And in fact, the Healing Wars has that as well, where, you know, it's like they talk about how the healers are called takers because they're allowed, because they can take pain away from people. So basically, takers start getting kidnapped whenever war is impending, right? Because everybody wants the healers to be on their side, so they start grabbing them and taking them off to heal their own army and create their, you know, all of their stuff, and then they get kidnapped back because they need to, you know, it's like, yeah. I mean, it's again this the way that a particular resource can lead to forms of crime, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I don't see it a whole ton of the time. Well, it's not that. It's not like you don't see crime in stories, but you don't see a lot of examination of the underpinnings of crime, like where it comes from and how it connects to the way that this whole system works. And I think that when you can actually get to the bottom of that, like, I mean, that was one of the things that the Healing Wars did amazingly well, is that it manages to connect the armies with the pain merchants, with the magic using healers, with the trackers who are kidnapping people, with, you know, like, and you can see how it all feeds into itself. And when you can grasp, well, I don't know, but I find when I'm grasping that kind of a larger pattern, I'm just like, oh, that is so cool, right? Not everybody geeks out on this sort of thing.
I keep thinking, when you're talking about a magic that's dependent on the skills of a particular individual, you can, looking at it from their point of view, even though they're valued, it can turn into kind of a golden cage.
Yeah. Yep.
They may have a lot of the best food and fine living conditions, but they're still imprisoned to some degree.
Well, and then the expectations that are placed on you, like as one of my characters is required to do things that she finds incredibly distasteful because of particular skill, and there are consequences for living like that.
Yeah.
Under that set of expectations. So.
Well, that happens in Healing Wars as well, actually.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a unique skill, it can lead you to some very serious problems. I wanted to actually, we're almost at the end here, but I wanted to actually mention one more thing, which is this golden cage idea, which I really love. Thanks for bringing it up, Glenda. People don't often have money and time at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you have a lot of money and time, you may not have something else. And in the case of the Varan cast, of course, the people who have the money and the time don't have health, right? Yeah. But sort of there's this balance of resources, and then, you know, just because you have money doesn't mean that your means to get it doesn't take up your entire existence, right? I wanted to talk specifically about the servant caste, and there's this very particular privileged group, high, what would you say, high privilege, definitely considered to be elite, right? The people who are the servants to the nobility are seen as the highest thing that you can aspire to, as a member of the servant caste, right? And these people are incredibly highly educated. They spend a lot of, they basically incur debt for their education, and then when they are hired by their employers, the first thing that the money goes to is paying back their debt for their education. So thinking about debt is important, right? But what you also find is that they then are very, very well paid, but their entire life is completely absorbed by their duties to this particular person, because they have to, you know, help them get dressed, you know, maybe help take care of their health, depending on who's doing it, or help them organize all of their files and make sure that their political life is working well. And so I often will compare them to geisha, who are within their society at the time were very highly regarded, and they're very highly trained people. They have these amazing skills, and at the same time, they are incredibly beholden to the lifestyle that they lead, and so they're very trapped and limited at the same time. And so it's interesting to look into that as, you know, exactly. I mean, there's so many examples from real life, butlers and all this kind of stuff. It's worth looking to see whether those people are in your society and how they cope with what they are handed, you know.
Yeah.
So we're out of time. This has been a hangout full of interesting things and riddled with technical difficulties, I'm afraid. So thanks to everybody. Che and Reggie, thank you for your persistence in remaining with us. and Glenda, thank you for your persistence in getting into the hangout. Oh my gosh. So I had the easiest job here today. But I think we talked about a lot of really cool stuff. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who watches. And I wanted to suggest, my husband has volunteered his services for a hangout. So I thought next week we could talk about sporting culture. With my husband as a guest. Because he is Australian and he has a lot of insights about international sporting culture, and it's actually really, really fascinating. So if this is just so everybody can know, invite people that you think might be interested in this topic. You're welcome to invite special people.
Okay.
And I think it'll be really fun, because I think we can also bring a little bit of the economics discussion in, because the economics of sports is also really, really important. So I'm sure that my husband will have things to say about that as well, given that he's a sort of economics guy and a sort of a sports guy. So join us next week for the culture of sports in world building. And I'm going to take us off the air. Thanks to everybody who listened, and we'll see you next week.